The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base in Afghanistan as Sarah Martinez adjusted her medical bag for the third time. As a civilian nurse working with the Red Cross, she had volunteered for this dangerous assignment knowing the risks. The remote outpost was surrounded by hostile territory, but the wounded soldiers needed her expertise. Sarah had always been drawn to helping others. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her mother work as a school nurse, tending to scraped knees and worried children. But Sarah wanted more. She wanted to save lives where it mattered most. At 28, she had already served in 3 conflict zones, earning respect from hardened military personnel who initially doubted the petite woman with determined brown eyes. The base commander, Colonel Williams, had briefed her team that morning about increased enemy activity in the region. Intelligence suggested possible attacks on supply convoys, but the medical mission had to continue. Wounded Marines were being transported from forward positions, and every hour of delay could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's partner for the day was Corporal James Jimmy Rodriguez, a 22-year-old Marine from California. Despite his youth, Jimmy had already completed 2 tours of duty and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a seasoned soldier. He respected Sarah's medical skills and had volunteered to escort her to the helicopter landing zone, where casualties were expected to arrive. The morning started routinely. Sarah treated minor injuries, administered medications, and prepared supplies for more serious cases. She joked with the Marines, sharing stories about home and listening to their concerns about families back in the States. Her gentle manner and professional competence had earned their trust and admiration. Around noon, the radio crackled with urgent communications. A patrol had been ambushed 15 miles northeast of the base. Multiple casualties were reported, including serious injuries that required immediate medical attention. The helicopter was already en route, but the landing zone was dangerously exposed to enemy fire. Sarah grabbed her trauma kit and followed Jimmy toward the designated landing area. The helicopter appeared as a distant speck against the harsh desert sky, growing larger as it approached through the swirling dust and heat. The pilot was pushing his aircraft to its limits, knowing that lives hung in the balance. As the helicopter touched down, Sarah could see the extent of the casualties through the open doors. 3 Marines lay on stretchers, their uniforms torn and bloodied. The crew chief was already performing emergency first aid, but his training had limits. Sarah's advanced medical knowledge was desperately needed. She rushed toward the aircraft, her mind automatically cataloging the supplies she would need. Jimmy stayed close beside her, his weapon ready as he scanned the perimeter for threats. The helicopter's engines remained running, ready for immediate takeoff if the situation became too dangerous. The most seriously wounded Marine was unconscious, with what appeared to be shrapnel wounds to his chest and abdomen. Sarah immediately began assessment procedures, checking vital signs and evaluating the extent of his injuries. His name tag read Thompson, and she could see he was barely 20 years old. Working quickly but carefully, Sarah established an IV line and began administering fluids to combat shock. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she applied pressure bandages to control bleeding. The helicopter crew watched in amazement as she transformed from a gentle nurse into a focused trauma specialist. The second Marine was conscious but in severe pain from a leg injury. Sarah could see bone fragments protruding through torn fabric, indicating a compound fracture. She administered pain medication and began stabilizing the limb for transport. His grateful eyes never left her face as she worked. Jimmy maintained security around the helicopter while keeping one eye on Sarah's medical work. He had seen many military medics in action, but Sarah's skill level impressed even him. She moved between patients with calm efficiency, prioritizing treatments based on the severity of injuries. The third Marine had sustained burns to his arms and face from an explosion. Sarah cleaned the wounds and applied specialized dressings designed to prevent infection and promote healing. She spoke quietly to him, explaining each procedure and offering reassurance that helped calm his fears. Suddenly, the helicopter pilot's voice cut through the noise of the engines. Enemy fighters had been spotted approaching the base perimeter. The aircraft needed to depart immediately or risk being shot down. Sarah looked at her patients, knowing that Thompson's condition remained critical and required continuous monitoring during transport. Without hesitation, she made the decision to accompany the wounded Marines back to the main medical facility. Jimmy started to object, knowing that civilians weren't supposed to leave the base, but Sarah was already climbing into the helicopter. Her duty was to her patients, regardless of regulations or personal safety. The helicopter lifted off, just as the first enemy rounds began impacting near the landing zone. Sarah continued working on Thompson during the flight, adjusting his IV and monitoring his breathing. The aircraft bounced and swayed through evasive maneuvers, but her focus never wavered from her patient. 15 minutes into the flight, Thompson went into cardiac arrest. Sarah immediately began CPR, counting compressions, while the helicopter raced toward the medical facility. The crew chief assisted as best he could in the cramped confines of the aircraft. Sarah refused to give up, continuing resuscitation efforts even as the helicopter prepared for landing. As they touched down at the main base hospital, Thompson's heart began beating again. Sarah had literally brought him back from death through her skill and determination. The medical team rushed all 3 patients into surgery, with Sarah providing detailed reports on each case. Colonel Williams arrived at the hospital as Sarah emerged from the operating room after assisting with Thompson's surgery. He had come to commend her actions, but also to inform her that Jimmy Rodriguez was missing. The helicopter that had returned to pick him up from the landing zone had been forced to abort due to heavy enemy fire. Sarah's heart sank as Colonel Williams explained the situation. Jimmy Rodriguez had been stranded at the exposed landing zone when the rescue helicopter came under enemy fire. Radio contact had been lost over an hour ago, and reconnaissance drones showed enemy forces moving toward his position. Time was running out. The colonel made it clear that Sarah was not authorized to participate in any rescue operation. As a civilian, she had already exceeded protocol by leaving the base. Military personnel would handle Jimmy's extraction, but weather conditions and enemy activity made it extremely dangerous. Sarah nodded her understanding, but her mind was already formulating plans. She spent the next 2 hours in the hospital, checking on Thompson and the other wounded Marines. All 3 were stable and recovering well from their surgeries. Thompson had regained consciousness and weakly thanked Sarah for saving his life. His gratitude touched her deeply, but she couldn't stop thinking about Jimmy alone in hostile territory. As evening approached, Sarah learned that the rescue mission had been postponed due to a sandstorm moving through the region. Visibility was near zero, making helicopter operations impossible. Jimmy would have to survive the night without support, assuming he was still alive. Unable to sleep, Sarah walked through the base, observing the organized chaos of military operations. Marines prepared for various contingencies, while intelligence officers analyzed enemy movements. The professionalism and dedication of these young service members reminded her why she had chosen this dangerous assignment. Around midnight, a reconnaissance patrol returned with disturbing news. They had spotted Jimmy's position from a distance, but he appeared to be injured and unable to move. Enemy forces were setting up positions nearby, apparently planning to capture him at dawn. The situation had become desperate. Sarah approached Colonel Williams with a proposal that shocked even her. She volunteered to accompany a small rescue team as their medical specialist. Her knowledge of the terrain and Jimmy's probable condition could be crucial to the mission's success. The colonel firmly refused, explaining that civilians could not be authorized for combat operations. Frustrated but not defeated, Sarah returned to her quarters and began planning an unauthorized rescue attempt. She knew the approximate location of Jimmy's position from studying maps with the reconnaissance team. Her medical training included wilderness survival skills, and she had enough supplies to treat serious injuries in field conditions. At 3 a.m, Sarah quietly left the base through a maintenance gate that she had observed during her evening walk. She wore borrowed military clothing and carried her medical kit along with water and basic survival gear. The sandstorm provided perfect cover for her unauthorized departure. The desert landscape was harsh and unforgiving even in darkness. Sarah navigated by compass and landmark recognition, drawing on survival training she had received during previous assignments. The temperature dropped significantly at night, and she struggled to maintain her bearings in the shifting sand and wind. After 2 hours of difficult travel, Sarah spotted the wreckage of a supply vehicle near Jimmy's last known position. She approached cautiously, using natural cover to avoid detection by enemy patrols. The silence was broken only by wind and the distant sound of military equipment. She found Jimmy sheltered behind the damaged vehicle, conscious but badly injured. He had sustained a gunshot wound to his left leg and was suffering from dehydration and exposure. His eyes widened in disbelief when he saw Sarah emerging from the darkness. Working by moonlight, Sarah assessed Jimmy's condition and began emergency treatment. The bullet had missed major arteries, but he had lost significant blood and was going into shock. She established an IV line and administered antibiotics to prevent infection. Jimmy protested weakly about her presence, knowing the danger she had accepted to reach him. Sarah explained her plan to move Jimmy to a position where rescue helicopters could safely extract them. She had identified a defensive position about half a mile away that offered better cover and a suitable landing zone. Jimmy argued that he was too injured to travel, but Sarah had already made her decision. Using materials from her kit and debris from the vehicle, Sarah constructed a makeshift stretcher. She secured Jimmy as comfortably as possible and began the exhausting process of dragging him across the desert. Her small frame struggled with his weight, but determination and adrenaline kept her moving. The journey took over an hour, with frequent stops to check Jimmy's condition and scan for enemy activity. Sarah's muscles ached, and her hands were torn from gripping the stretcher. But she refused to give up. Jimmy drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling apologies for putting her in danger. They reached the defensive position just as dawn began lighting the eastern horizon. Sarah immediately radioed the base using Jimmy's emergency beacon, providing their coordinates and requesting immediate extraction. She knew that daylight would make them visible to enemy forces, turning their refuge into a trap. The response came within minutes. A rescue helicopter was already airborne, but enemy activity in the area was increasing. Sarah would need to defend their position until the aircraft could reach them. Jimmy pressed his sidearm into her hands, knowing that her medical oath wouldn't prevent her from protecting them both. Enemy fighters appeared on the ridgeline overlooking their position just as the helicopter became visible in the distance. Sarah found herself in the unthinkable situation of choosing between her healing mission and the need for survival. She positioned herself to shield Jimmy while preparing to defend their location. The helicopter pilot radioed that he was taking enemy fire but would attempt the rescue anyway. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as hostile forces tried to prevent the extraction. She returned fire to protect Jimmy, her hands shaking as she fought against everything her medical training represented. During the final approach, the helicopter took several hits but managed to land near their position. Sarah and the crew chief worked together to load Jimmy aboard the aircraft. As they lifted off under intense fire, Sarah collapsed from exhaustion and stress, her body finally surrendering to the physical and emotional demands of the rescue mission. Sarah's eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar surroundings. Bright lights and clean white walls replaced the harsh desert landscape she remembered. The steady beeping of medical monitors and the smell of disinfectant told her she was in a hospital, but nothing else made sense. Her last clear memory was of gunfire and helicopter rotors, followed by overwhelming exhaustion. A nurse noticed her stirring and immediately called for a doctor. Within minutes, Sarah was surrounded by medical personnel checking her vital signs and asking questions about her condition. She learned that she had been unconscious for 18 hours, suffering from severe dehydration, exhaustion, and mild shock from her ordeal in the desert. Dr. Patricia Chen, the chief medical officer, explained what had happened after Sarah lost consciousness. The helicopter had successfully extracted both her and Jimmy despite taking enemy fire. Jimmy was recovering well from surgery on his leg wound, and his prognosis was excellent thanks to Sarah's immediate medical intervention in the field. Sarah asked about the consequences of her unauthorized rescue mission. She expected disciplinary action, possibly even criminal charges for violating military protocols and endangering personnel. Dr. Chen smiled mysteriously and suggested that Sarah should speak with Colonel Williams when she felt strong enough. After another day of rest and medical observation, Sarah was cleared for limited activity. She visited Jimmy in the recovery ward, finding him alert and surrounded by fellow Marines. His face lit up when he saw her, and he struggled to sit up despite his injuries. The other Marine stepped aside respectfully as Sarah approached his bed. Jimmy grasped her hand and struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude. He explained that he had given up hope of rescue when enemy forces began closing in on his position. Sarah's appearance in the darkness had seemed like a miracle, and her courage during the extraction had saved both their lives. Colonel Williams arrived as they were talking and requested a private meeting with Sarah. She expected a formal reprimand, but the colonel's expression suggested something entirely different. He led her to his office, where several other senior officers were waiting along with a civilian official she didn't recognize. The colonel began by acknowledging that Sarah's actions had violated multiple regulations and protocols. However, he continued, her courage and medical expertise had saved the life of a Marine and demonstrated extraordinary heroism under fire. The incident had generated significant attention at the highest levels of military command. The civilian official introduced himself as a representative from the Department of Defense. He explained that Sarah's actions had been reviewed by senior leadership, including the Secretary of Defense. Rather than facing disciplinary action, she was being recommended for one of the military's highest civilian honors. Sarah listened in stunned silence as the official described plans for a formal ceremony. Her rescue of Jimmy Rodriguez had inspired personnel throughout the military, and leadership wanted to recognize her courage publicly. The ceremony would take place at the main base in 3 days, with representatives from various military branches attending. Over the next 2 days, Sarah struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. Military personnel approached her constantly to express their respect and admiration. She received messages from family members back home who had learned about her actions through military channels. The attention felt overwhelming for someone who had simply done what she believed was right. Jimmy was released from the hospital in time to attend the ceremony. Despite his leg injury, he insisted on being present to honor the woman who had risked everything to save him. Other Marines Sarah had treated, including Thompson, also received permission to attend despite their medical conditions. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright. Sarah was escorted to a reviewing stand erected on the base parade ground. As she took her designated position, she was amazed to see hundreds of military personnel assembled in perfect formation. Representatives from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines filled the parade ground in dress uniforms. Colonel Williams served as master of ceremonies, beginning with a detailed account of Sarah's actions during the rescue mission. He described her unauthorized departure from the base, her dangerous journey through enemy territory, and her life-saving medical treatment of Jimmy Rodriguez under fire. His voice carried clearly across the silent assembly. The Department of Defense representative then stepped forward to read the citation for Sarah's award. The language was formal and military, but the meaning was clear. Sarah had demonstrated extraordinary courage and selfless devotion to duty in the face of extreme danger. Her actions reflected the highest traditions of service and sacrifice. As the official prepared to present the medal, something unexpected happened. Jimmy Rodriguez, despite his injuries, stood and began to applaud. Within seconds, every person on the parade ground was standing and clapping. The applause continued for several minutes as 500 Marines, soldiers, airmen, and sailors honored Sarah's courage. The medal ceremony proceeded with full military honors. Sarah was presented with the Defense Department's highest civilian decoration for heroism. The weight of the medal seemed insignificant compared to the emotional impact of the moment. She looked out over the sea of faces and saw respect, admiration, and gratitude reflected in hundreds of eyes. After the formal ceremony, individual Marines approached Sarah to express their personal thanks. Many shared stories of family members who served as military medics or nurses. Others simply wanted to shake the hand of someone who embodied the values they had sworn to uphold. Thompson, still recovering from his wounds, presented Sarah with a small American flag that had flown over their forward operating base. He explained that the flag represented the appreciation of every Marine who had benefited from her medical care. The simple gesture moved Sarah more than all the formal recognition she had received. Later that evening, Sarah attended a reception hosted by the base commander. Military personnel mingled with civilian contractors and medical staff, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie and mutual respect. Sarah found herself surrounded by people eager to hear her story and express their admiration for her actions. During the reception, Sarah was approached by several young medics and nurses who viewed her as a role model. They asked questions about her training and experience, seeking guidance for their own careers. Sarah realized that her actions had created responsibilities beyond the immediate rescue mission. As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside to reflect on the events of the past week. The desert air was cool and clear, with stars visible despite the base lighting. She thought about the chain of decisions that had led her to this moment. Beginning with her choice to volunteer for dangerous assignment, Jimmy Rodriguez found her there and joined her in quiet contemplation. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Jimmy eventually spoke, expressing his hope that Sarah's example would inspire others to acts of similar courage and selflessness. The following week, Sarah returned to her regular duties at the base hospital. The attention gradually subsided as military operations resumed their normal pace. However, the respect she had earned from military personnel remained evident in their interactions with her. Sarah received notification that her actions had been documented in official military records and would be taught in leadership courses for years to come. Her unauthorized rescue mission had become a case study in moral courage and individual initiative. The recognition felt surreal to someone who had simply followed her conscience. Months later, after completing her assignment in Afghanistan, Sarah returned to civilian life in the United States. She was invited to speak at military academies and medical schools about her experiences. Her story had become part of military folklore, inspiring new generations of service members and medical professionals. Sarah never considered herself a hero. She had simply seen someone in need and responded according to her training and values. The recognition and honors were appreciated, but the greatest reward was knowing that Jimmy Rodriguez had returned home safely to his family. That knowledge made every risk and sacrifice worthwhile. The medal and flag from her ceremony held places of honor in her home, but they served as reminders of responsibility rather than achievements. Sarah understood that true courage wasn't measured by awards or recognition, but by the willingness to act when others needed help, regardless of personal cost or consequence.